Hello, Hadaka Guy here. Wanted to take a second and show you what I'm finding on my quest to return my 75 FJ40 Land Cruiser fuel gauge and temperature gauge back to functioning. So recently driving around town, both the temperature gauge and the coolant gauge would randomly quit working. It might go that way for a half a day and then they pop back to life and then they quit again. So last weekend I took the cluster out, cleaned all the contacts on the back of the circuit board, put it all back together. It was functioning again. Thought I had it fixed, drove around town, and it quit again. So after a little bit of internet research and YouTube watching, basically came down to more than likely the culprit is this little voltage regulator right here on the back of the fuel gauge. So on the fuel gauge of this Land Cruiser, 12 volts is applied to this terminal here. It goes through this regulator, which is a bimetallic unit. So that U-shaped strip of metal back there, as current flows through it, it heats up, expands, and those little contacts right here, those little points, will break and close and break and close. And the average of that is 6 volts coming out of this pin right here, this terminal here, which ultimately jumpers over and feeds the temperature gauge. And then this post over here connects the fuel sender to the fuel gauge and ultimately runs the gauge itself. So what I think is happening in my case, and I should have filmed this from the get-go because I've already bench tested this and made some adjustments, is that these points right here were dirty, and as I connected power here and watched with a trouble light the power coming out of this, it was inconsistent. It would blink fairly steady, and then it would stop and freeze up, and then it would pause for a long time and then start working again. So I think what was happening is that regulator was hanging up and the voltage would stop regulating. Both gauges would go dead. Eventually, you hit a bump or something, this thing would start functioning again for a while and come back to life. So what I did is took these points, carefully lifted these points open, and you have to be really careful of that wire right there. Very thin, you do not want to break it. But I would lift these points, and there's a couple different ways to dress the points on these. I ended up dressing it with just a piece of folded over 600 grit emery cloth. Popped those points open, ran the emery cloth in, and just ran it back and forth. You don't need to do it a whole lot, 7-8 times, pop it out. You don't want to leave any grit in there, so I carefully popped it open again with the screwdriver, blew it out, and then I ran a rag with some contact cleaner carefully through it just to clean those contacts back. This screw right here, I shouldn't have to mess with that, but that regulates the distance, how far that thing is going to open and close, which ultimately changes the average voltage coming out of this post here. So after I did that, dress the points on that, bench tested it again, and the light is nice and steady now. It's not intermittent like it was before, so I have high hopes that when I put this all back together, that both gauges will now be functioning. I'll show you a quick test here. Let me just get this up where you can see it. Basically, to test this unit on the bench, you can use a 9-volt battery, or you can I'm using a 12-volt regulated power supply. Basically, here on the back of the gauge, right here in the middle, is the ground pin. So I'll take my ground coming from the power supply, connect that right there. Then I will take 12-volt regulated power, connect it to that pin right there. And then what I'm going to use is just a regular 12-volt trouble light. I'll connect that to the output pin that goes over to the temperature gauge. And then when we reach over here and connect that to ground, you'll see it light up. And it'll warm up for just a second, and then it should start pulsing. I think I'm getting a good ground there. There we go. Yeah, and that's nice and steady now. So that is outputting around 6 volts on that middle pin. And then if we take the same and jump it over to the terminal for the gauge itself and go back onto ground again, we'll see it pulse. Should pulse a little faster. And now the gauge should start slowly moving. Now how high the gauge goes up depends on the resistance value of this particular test light. You can see the gauge is slowly climbing. So when I did this before, this was very intermittent. It would stop completely, it would blink, it would start blinking again, blink super slow, pick up speed. So this is nice and consistent now since I addressed those points. And you can see it tops out with this particular, the resistance of this test light tops out at about a 1/4 tank on the gauge. So the gauge is functioning, the regulator seems to be working a lot better. So I will put it all back together and we'll see what happens. I'll let you guys know how it works.